You know, when I first responded to the idea that there were too many weapons in Battlefield, I sort of wrote off the idea as completely ridiculous. After all, how could a game be made more varied by removing weapons from it? More is more, not less. But within every stupid argument on the internet, there lies a legitimate reason for concern, and I think I've happened upon it. When people say that they want less weapons, they don't really mean that. When they say that we could improve variety by removing redundant weapons, such as the CZ-805, M416, G36C, and half of the bolt actions, they don't really mean that either. What they mean is that there is too much overlap between certain weapons, and that there are some situations that we simply don't have weapons for. We don't have too many weapons, or weapons that aren't varied enough. We have weapons with shared roles. So we don't have too many weapons, we have far too few. When people say all this, they are saying that they want weapons that are more widely distributed across a large variety of effective ranges. But I'm not saying that we need more than the 16 assault rifles we have, for example. But we could expand the variety of weapons we have without adding or removing any. We could, for example, give the CZ-805 a rate of fire of 850. We could give the M416 a battle caliber. But the issue with this is that we lose authenticity. The HK416 does not shoot a 7.62 NATO round, and the CZ-805 could not plausibly cycle that quickly without running into issues. It's important to note that a developer can represent an actual weapon in any way they choose, but they typically try to keep the weapon's in-game representation at least somewhat akin to what we'd find in the actual weapon. For example, the M16 does have a cyclic rate of fire of around 800 RPM, though this varies depending on what the weapon is shooting, and it really does shoot a 5.56 NATO round, just as the real-life AEK can shoot a 5.45 round at 900 RPM. Now this is just my theory. The reason we have so many guns that overlap one another, like the AR-160 and the CZ-805, or the M416 and the H-23, is because the weapon was decided before its intended role was. Someone said, hey, let's put an ARX into this game. So the weapon artists made themselves an AR-160. It was then handed over to the gameplay designer, who said, well, I guess I'd better give it a rate of fire of around 700, so that it's not too far removed from what the in-game weapon is supposed to represent. And at this point we now have two weapons with the same damage model and rate of fire, the CZ-805 and the AR-160. There's only so much you can do to make weapons this similar unique, which means that we have two near-identical weapons. This, in turn, eats people who whine about weapons not being unique enough. Remember, this is all just my theory, but it seems to fit. We have weapons that are too similar because the weapon chosen to be represented was chosen before its stats were. So rather than going from weapon artist chooses a gun, then the gameplay designer makes its stats to fit, we do it the other way around. The weapon artists are forced to work within the constraints of weapons that are good for gameplay, whereas the gameplay designer is free to create whatever weapon he pleases to make Battlefield a balanced and varied game. So since people want more weapons to be unique, how about we add some instead of removing them? There are a ton of weapon niches and specialty roles that we have not explored in Battlefield 4, so I'll talk about each of them, and the potential real-life candidates that could translate well into the game, and fit into the roles we have already established. Of the 16 assault rifles we have in-game, only 2 are heavy hitters, shooting a battle caliber. Of the 12 carbines we have, only one of them shoots a 7.62 NATO round, and therefore has a heavier damage model. And across these 28 weapons, only one of them falls into the middle, with the Russian 7.62x39 Groza 1. PTWs are a bit more interesting, with 8 of the 14 weapons in this class having a damage model unique to that specific weapon. So right away we see that there need to be more heavy-hitting weapons in the assault class, and especially among the all-kit carbines. Let's start with the assault rifles. We have 2 weapons with a larger damage model, the Bulldog and the SCAR. They both sit pretty close to one another in rate of fire, and they both perform similar roles. The SCAR is more intended for mid-range, while the Bulldog performs at close range, but there's quite a bit of overlap with their effective ranges. What we don't have is a 33 max damage weapon with a very high rate of fire for extreme close quarters, nor do we have one with an extremely low rate of fire for actual long-range engagements. So we need some 7.62 weapons, represented in game by a 33 to 21.6 damage model, capable at range. This translates in-game to a rate of fire of around 500 to compete with the SAR-21 and QBZ, and 550 to compete with the CZ-805 and AR-160. We don't have many modern options for this, as the battle rifle isn't very much in fashion at the moment, but possible candidates for this role could be the HCAR, which we see already represented with marginal success in Hardline, and the G3, which is already a fan favorite. With more vertical recoil, but less horizontal recoil than their 5.56 counterparts, with similar damage per second, these weapons require significantly more accuracy to use effectively, but could be used at a broader variety of ranges. While the SAR-21 is great at range, it suffers considerably in close quarters, but a weapon shooting at 500 RPM with 0.12, 0.4, 0.12 recoil, with 1.25 first shot multiplier, can still compete in close quarters, while performing similarly to the SAR-21 at long range. Our hypothetical G3 is similar, though it doesn't take it as far. This weapon with a 550 RPM rate of fire is more comparable to the CZ-805, and as such would have 0.2, 0.42, 0.15 recoil, with 1.25 first shot multiplier and standard spread decrease and spread increase values. This gives us a selection of heavy hitters that perform at a variety of ranges, from close range, the Bulldog, to long range, the HCAR. You'll note that both of these weapons have significant recoil, but the very low first shot multiplier allows the use of an angled grip to achieve a 1x multiplier, bringing its first shot recoil to levels well under that of the Ace-23. Again, spread increase and spread decrease are determined by a formula in Battlefield 4 to keep the values consistent, and to ensure that low rate of fire weapons get the proper damage per second advantage at range. You can review these formulas in the description and how they are used to determine spread increase and spread decrease values for each weapon that I propose. Heavy hitters with a rate of fire higher than 700 are a bit more difficult to balance. They get so much horizontal recoil at that point that it's hard to consider using them, considering how reliant the heavy hitters are on accuracy. So rather than introducing more 7.62 NATO weapons into the game, why not include some Russian caliber medium damage weapons? We only have one of these in the entire game, the RPK, with a 30 to 20 damage model. I can't mention potential 7.62x39 rifles without mentioning the AKM, which remains my personal favorite, primarily for its aesthetic value. With a rate of fire of 600 RPM and the RPK's 30 to 20 damage model, it can safely use 0.22, 0.37, 0.25 recoil with 1.75 first shot multiplier. While it has less spread increase and faster spread decrease than the G3, its higher horizontal recoil makes it less accurate, and its higher first shot multiplier makes it less accurate for the first few bullets and more difficult to use, though it does have less vertical recoil overall, making it a great candidate for the heavy barrel. I'd also like to look at a weapon shooting at 900 RPM with the 30 to 20 damage model we see in the RPK. The only weapon I can see represented in game with this damage model is the AEK 973, which is essentially just an AEK 971 chambered for the 7.62x39 round. Now, because a guaranteed 4-hit kill at 900 RPM is going to be pretty absurd, the weapon will need equally absurd recoil stats at 0.53, 0.65, 0.6, with a 2.5 first shot multiplier. I've already been told by a gameplay designer that this weapon will never happen, but I still think it would fit with this absurd recoil. The compensator is almost surely the only viable barrel attachment for this weapon, and it benefits a great deal from the angled grip. A carbine variant of this weapon, the AEK 973S, could be introduced, with identical stats except for having the damage model of the Groza 1, and worse base spread, but better hipfire. Speaking of weapons that are good in close quarters, why don't we have more burst-only weapons? We already have an AN-94. That weapon turned out to be a long-range DMR wannabe, rather than the close quarters bullet hose we had in Battlefield 3. So what if we were to give the AN-94 a 7.62 damage model? The first thing to address is its rate of fire in burst compared to its rate of fire in automatic. We can't give it the stats of a 600 RPM weapon, like the AN-94 has, and let it burst at an effective 705, like the AN-94, because it will completely outclass the AKM we just introduced. So our AN-94 will be limited to permanent burst, and will have recoil stats similar to a 650 RPM weapon, but it will retain the spread increase and spread decrease values of a 700 RPM weapon. This gives us 0.3, 0.49, 0.3 recoil, with 1.75 first shot multiplier. This makes it slightly more accurate and easy to use than the Bulldog, but less accurate than the AKM. If the AN-94-762 existed in-game, I would say that it would almost certainly replace the AEK-971 as the gun of choice for close quarters maps. This weapon would work especially well with compensator and stubby grip to improve its range. But a strictly close quarters loadout of ergo and heavy barrel would also work, since it has less vertical recoil than the SCAR. While there are a few other assault rifles I'd like to talk about, I'll leave it at that for now. We still don't have an automatic weapon shooting 7.62 NATO above 700 RPM. The LCZ B20 could be an option for this, with a rate of fire around 750. The 7.62x39 version of this weapon, also shooting at 750 RPM, the LCZ B10, would also be an interesting addition. What about the other weapon classes? We already have an exceptional amount of variety among the submachine guns, and there really aren't any other additions that I think would be worth including. Many weapons could plausibly be put into either the carbine or submachine gun category. After all, the OTS-14 is represented as the Groza 1 in-game, is considered an assault rifle, as is the A91. In the interest of time, I'm only going to go over two more weapons, with both of which being able to fit into either a PDW or a carbine class. In fact, depending on how they're set up, they can fit into both classes with different integral attachments. Once again, like the UTS, being a carbine as the Groza 1, or a PDW as the Groza 4. The first weapon is chambered in 7.62x39, primarily, but it can also be set up to shoot the 5.6x39mm cartridge. If it did the latter, it could potentially be put into the PDW class, but I'm going to call it a carbine for the time being. This is the Korobov assault rifle, which we call the TKB-022. This is easily the ugliest weapon I've ever seen. In addition to looking much like a trout, it has a hideous plastic shell around the working components. That said, it does do some interesting things, as we represent it in-game. Since it has a 400mm barrel, and its 500mm total length, it could potentially have a more accurate base spread than other carbines, say 0.25 rather than 0.3, giving it the same accuracy as a bullpup assault rifle. It fires extremely slowly at 560 RPM, so this would complement its very low rate of fire nicely. Since this weapon is a carbine, I'll give it the damage model of the Groza 1, or 30 to 16.7. Fitting recoil values, 0.15, 0.33, 0.15, with a 1.5 times first shot multiplier. This would give the carbine class a weapon with reasonable performance at range, and close quarters damage output similar to the AKU-12 and G36C. This weapon would almost certainly want to use the heavy barrel and stubby grip. Lastly, I'd like to take a look at a potential engineer weapon, or P2W if you want to call it, the ASH 12.7. Again, this is considered an assault rifle, but the ammunition it uses, and thus the damage model I propose in-game, would fit very well among the PDWs. The intent behind the design was, and I quote, to combine high stopping power with limited penetration and short, dangerous range. This sounds like the very essence of a PDW in Battlefield 4. There is absolutely no information on what its rate of fire could be, so I'll set it at 630. Now, this 12.7x55 caliber is quite comparable to the 50 Beowulf and the 499 LWR, so I'm going to give it more maximum damage than the UMP-45. But because it is supposed to have a very short effective range, its minimum damage will be standard PDW. This is the only original damage model that I'm using here, so I'll have to explain what my SIPS and spread decrease values are. Since it will have 35 max damage and 13.5 minimum, with a 15 meter drop-off start and 45 meter drop-off end, I will use a 1.33 damage modifier, or N in the formulas, compared to the UMP's 1.2. This yields 0.108 spread decrease per shot and 9.2 spread decrease, which is very similar to the SCAR. It will have slightly more vertical recoil and much more horizontal recoil than the UMP-45, at 0.25, 0.4, 0.25, with a 1.75 times first shot multiplier. On top of all this, it will have an integrated suppressor and heavy barrel combo attachment, similar to the Groza 4 and ASFAL in-game. This gives us a weapon with very good close quarters performance, with a very low rate of fire. Its 3-hit kill, if you only hit the legs or armor no more than once, is compensated for by a high spread increase and very poor performance at range. I know we've only covered a few weapons here, but this video is too long already. To to do nothing more than glance at the support class. It would be nice if we had an LMG with a rate of fire higher than 800. The recon class could also use a few more semi-automatic sniper rifles to add to the one we have already, the SR-338. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you stick around for future content.